Thursday, July 13th, 1944. Camp Ruston, Louisiana, United States. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter's hands trembled as he gripped the cold, curved glass bottle thrust into his palm by an American guard. The strange brown liquid inside bubbled and hissed, releasing a sweet, unfamiliar aroma that cut through the humid southern air like nothing he'd ever encountered. Ice crystals beaded on the bottle's surface. Actual ice in July, wasted on a prisoner's drink. "What is this?" Klaus whispered in German to the man beside him, Unteroffizier Hans Weber from Stuttgart. Hans stared at his own bottle, equally bewildered. Around them, 36 German soldiers stood in the recreation yard, each holding an identical glass container with red and white script they couldn't read. The American sergeant who distributed them grinned, made a drinking motion, and walked away as if he'd done nothing extraordinary. "Coca-Cola," said Feldwebel Otto Baumann, who'd picked up some English during interrogation. "It's a drink. For pleasure." For pleasure. The words hung in the air like an impossible promise. Klaus brought the bottle to his nose. The scent was intoxicating, sweet but complex, with hints of something citrus, something he couldn't identify. Carbonation tickled his nostrils. His stomach, accustomed to bitter ersatz coffee and watered-down soup, cramped with sudden, desperate hunger for whatever this was. "It could be poisoned," Hans muttered, though his eyes betrayed his longing. Klaus watched an American soldier across the fence casually pop open his own bottle against a fence post, tilt his head back, and drain half of it in one long swallow. The GI didn't collapse, didn't grimace, just wiped his mouth with satisfaction and tossed the empty bottle into a crate that already held dozens of others. Dozens. They were throwing them away. "Mein Gott," Klaus breathed. They throw them away. Klaus Richter had been a machinist in Essen before the war. Drafted in 1941 at age 23. He'd fought in North Africa with the 21st Panzer Division, survived Kasserine Pass, and finally surrendered with the remnants of the Afrika Corps in Tunisia in May 1943. 14 months of sand, heat, dysentery, and watching his friends die from infected wounds because medical supplies had dried up months before the end. The propaganda had been clear, drilled into every soldier from basic training onward. America was soft, decadent, weakened by Jewish influence and mongrel breeding. Americans couldn't fight. They couldn't produce quality weapons. They certainly couldn't sustain a war effort against the industrial might and discipline of the Reich. Minister Goebbels himself had declared that American soldiers were cowardly shopkeepers in uniform who would break at the first sign of real combat. Klaus had believed it. They all had. Even when American tanks and artillery pieces began appearing in North Africa in quantities that seemed impossible, even when American bombers darkened the skies over Europe, the explanations came. British manufacturing, Soviet labor, stolen German designs, never genuine American capability. Never. The numbers told a different story, though Klaus wouldn't learn the full scale until years later. In 1943, Germany produced 17,000 military aircraft. America produced 85,000. German tank production peaked at 19,000 units for the entire war. America built 88,000. German synthetic fuel capacity struggled to reach 5 million tons annually. American crude oil production exceeded 200 million tons. The ratios were staggering, impossible, and carefully hidden from German soldiers, who were told that victory was just one more offensive away. In Essen, Klaus's family received 1,400 calories per day from official rations by 1943, barely enough to survive. His mother wrote letters describing how she boiled potato peels for soup, how his younger sister had stopped menstruating from malnutrition, how they burned furniture for heat when coal ran out. That was normal. That was total war. Everyone sacrificed. The Führer asked it, and the Volk endured. What Klaus didn't know, couldn't have known, was that behind the wire fence in Louisiana, he was about to encounter a nation that had never understood sacrifice, not the way he did. The bottle sweated in his palm. Klaus watched Otto take the first sip, saw his eyes widen, saw him lower the bottle slowly and stare at it like it had spoken to him. "Try it," Otto said quietly. Klaus raised the bottle. The glass rim touched his lips, smooth, perfectly molded, without a single flaw. He tilted it back. The first sensation was cold, not cool, not refreshing. Cold, a shock of ice that seemed impossible in July heat. Then sweetness flooded his mouth, overwhelming, almost painful after years of bland rations. The carbonation fizzed on his tongue, prickled his throat. The flavor was unlike anything he'd tasted. Caramel and vanilla and citrus and something mysterious, something that seemed to contain sunlight and celebration, and everything he'd forgotten existed in the world. He swallowed. The cold liquid slid down his throat, and for a moment, just a moment, he wasn't a prisoner, wasn't a defeated soldier, wasn't a man whose nation was burning. He was someone sitting in a cafe on a summer afternoon, tasting something wonderful simply because he wanted to. Klaus looked at the bottle. 8 ounces, the glass read, wherever he could see English numbers. 8 ounces of pure, sweet, cold pleasure given to prisoners, given away like it was nothing. His hands started shaking again, but not from cold this time. Around him, other men were drinking, their faces cycling through the same sequence. Shock, pleasure, confusion, and then something darker, realization. "They give this to prisoners," Hans said slowly, still holding his half-empty bottle. "To prisoners. Every day," an American corporal called over in broken German, misunderstanding the comment's meaning. He held up 7 fingers. 7 cents. Very cheap. 7 cents. Klaus had no idea what that meant in practical terms, but the casualness of the gesture, the implication that this luxury cost almost nothing, landed like a punch to his solar plexus. "The Americans drink this," Otto said, his voice strange and flat. "The civilians, the children, they drink this for pleasure." No one answered. They were all doing the math they didn't want to do, making the comparisons they'd spent months avoiding. In Germany, sugar rations had been cut to 200 grams per month per person, roughly 1 tablespoon per day. This single bottle contained more sugar than Klaus's entire family received in a week, and the Americans drank it casually, by the millions, every single day, while fighting a war on 2 fronts and barely noticing the cost. Klaus took another sip. The sweetness felt like an accusation. 3 days later, the supply truck arrived at Camp Ruston carrying routine provisions. Klaus, assigned to unloading duty, helped carry crates from the truck bed to the warehouse. The 3rd crate he lifted was wooden, stamped with red and white logos he now recognized instantly. Coca-Cola, cases and cases of it. He counted as they unloaded. 48 crates, each holding 24 bottles. 152 bottles for 1 delivery for 1 camp. "How many camps?" Klaus asked Corporal Mitchell in his broken English. Mitchell shrugged. "For Germans, maybe 600 in the States. All get deliveries." 600. Klaus's mind reeled. If each camp received even half this amount, that meant he couldn't complete the calculation. The numbers were too large, too impossible. Millions of bottles, millions of pounds of sugar. Billions of ounces of liquid luxury, distributed to prisoners and civilians alike while Germany's children starved. In Germany, Klaus said carefully, searching for English words, "Sugar is very small. Not much." "Yeah?" Mitchell pulled out a Coca-Cola for himself, popped the cap. "Rough luck. War and all. You guys started it, though." He drank deeply, then offered Klaus one. Klaus took it. He always took it now. Not because he'd lost his pride, though perhaps he had, but because refusing seemed like an even more pathetic gesture. Refusing didn't make Germany stronger. It just left him thirsty. That night, lying on his bunk, a real mattress, not straw, not bare ground, Klaus wrote a letter to his mother. The censors would read it, cut anything sensitive, but he tried anyway. "The Americans have drinks here, Mama. Sweet drinks, cold drinks, drinks they give away like water. I don't know how to explain what this means. I don't know what we've been fighting against." 3 lines. The censors let them pass. July 28, 1944. The camp established a recreation canteen. Klaus walked into the wooden building expecting the usual. A few decks of cards, maybe some German newspapers. Instead, he found a fully stocked shop. Cigarettes, chocolate bars, chewing gum, magazines, and a refrigerated case, a humming, electric refrigerated case, filled with rows of Coca-Cola bottles, their glass surfaces frosted and gleaming under electric lights. 5 cents, said the attendant, a private too young for combat duty, or free if you work detail. We got credits. Klaus had worked loading trucks that morning. He had credits. He took 3 bottles. The private didn't blink, didn't question. Just took the chit, made a note, handed over the drinks. Klaus carried them back to the barracks, gave one each to Hans and Otto. They sat on their bunks in silence, drinking slowly, trying to process what they'd seen. "A shop," Otto finally said. "A shop in a prison camp." "With refrigeration," Hans added. Electricity for refrigeration for prisoners' sodas. Klaus turned his bottle, watching the light play through the brown liquid. How much electricity does a refrigerator use? Otto had been an engineer before the war. Maybe 1 kilowatt-hour per day. Maybe more for commercial units. "And they run it," Klaus said, "to keep prisoners' drinks cold." The implications spiraled outward. Germany was running on synthetic fuel, rationing electricity, shutting down factories for lack of coal. Power plants were prioritized for war production, every watt scrutinized, allocated, controlled. And here, the Americans were running refrigerators in prison camps. For comfort, for luxury, for Coca-Cola. "They have so much," Hans whispered, "that they can waste it on us." Later, Klaus would learn the full scale. In 1944, American electrical generation capacity exceeded 280 billion kilowatt-hours, Germany's 55 billion. America's per capita electricity consumption was 6 times higher and still had surplus for non-essential uses. They could refrigerate prisoners' sodas because they had generating capacity to spare. But that night, Klaus only knew what he could see: a glowing cooler in a prison canteen, running continuously, burning power Germany would kill to have, all to keep a luxury beverage at optimal temperature for captured enemy soldiers. He finished his Coca-Cola. The sweetness had started to taste like defeat. August 1944. Work assignments at Camp Ruston were voluntary, but most prisoners signed up. Boredom was the real enemy, and the work was absurdly light compared to military service. Picking cotton, loading supplies, maintaining grounds. Klaus joined a crew helping to expand the camp's infrastructure. The supply sergeant for the construction project was a Texan named Douglas, a broad-faced man in his 40s who treated the POWs with casual friendliness that Klaus found more disturbing than hostility. Douglas didn't seem to hate them. Didn't seem to think about them much at all, really, except as workers who needed direction and occasional sodas. "Break time," Douglas called one afternoon. "Coke's in the cooler." Klaus and the other men dropped their tools and lined up. The cooler was a massive, galvanized steel tank filled with ice and bottles. Real ice, blocks of it, delivered daily by truck. Klaus had stopped asking questions about the logistics. Every answer made things worse. He pulled out a Coca-Cola, pressed it against his forehead before opening it. The Louisiana heat was crushing, over 100 degrees, the humidity thick enough to swim through. The cold bottle felt like salvation. Douglas popped his own bottle open and leaned against a post. "Y'all working hard. Good effort." Klaus's English had improved through weeks of conversation. "The work is not difficult." "Nah, it's shit work," Douglas agreed cheerfully. "Hot as hell, too. But somebody's got to do it, right? War don't stop construction." Klaus drank his Coca-Cola, watching Douglas. The sergeant's boots were good leather, barely worn. His uniform was clean, pressed, replaced regularly. The canteen on his belt was full of actual cold water. The watch on his wrist was Swiss-made, probably looted, but still, a working watch, worn casually, not treasured like the precious instrument it would be in Germany. "Sergeant Douglas," Klaus said carefully, "how much does Coca-Cola cost? In America? For civilians? 5 cents a bottle usually, sometimes 6. Depression days it was a nickel everywhere though. 5 cents. Klaus did the mental conversion. That was roughly 20 Reichspfennig, the price of a single egg in pre-war Germany. The price of nothing. And everyone drinks this? Sure. Kids, workers, everybody. Hell, we sent millions of bottles to troops overseas. Eisenhower himself said Coke was essential for morale. Douglas laughed. Probably right, too. Nothing like a cold Coke after a hot day. Klaus felt something crack inside him. Not break. He'd broken weeks ago, but crack, like ice under pressure, a deep structural fissure spreading through his understanding of the world. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, had said that Coca-Cola, this sweet, luxury beverage, was essential, not for nutrition, not for medicine, for morale, because American soldiers expected pleasure, expected comfort, expected to have their desires met even in the middle of a global war, and the nation could afford it, could manufacture it, could ship it across oceans, could distribute it to millions of men while simultaneously producing tanks and planes and bombs in quantities that made German production look like a handicraft workshop. What was it like, Klaus asked suddenly, before the war in America? Douglas thought about it, taking a long drink. Pretty good, mostly. Had the Depression, that was rough. But even then, most folks had enough. Jobs were tight, money was tight. But we managed. Not like Europe, though. We heard it was bad over there. Bad, Klaus repeated. Bad didn't cover it. Bad didn't describe watching your neighbor's children turn skeletal, didn't describe the taste of sawdust in bread, didn't describe burning books for heat. Yes, bad. Well, Douglas said philosophically, that's what war does. Tears everything up. But we'll get it sorted. Marshall Plan and all that. Rebuild. Klaus stared at his Coca-Cola bottle. The Marshall Plan. He'd heard whispers about it. American plans to rebuild Europe after the war, to pour billions into reconstruction, not as punishment, not as exploitation, but as investment. Because America could afford to. Because the nation that was fighting the most expensive war in human history still had resources to spare for peacetime planning. The bottle in his hand represented something he was only beginning to understand. It wasn't just a drink. It was proof of capacity, proof of abundance. Proof that every single thing the Reich had told him about American weakness and decadence was a lie. The decadent nation had crushed the disciplined one. The soft nation had outproduced the industrial powerhouse. The mongrel democracy had shattered the master race. And they'd done it while drinking Coca-Cola. September 1944. A Red Cross inspection team visited Camp Ruston. Klaus watched from the workyard as official observers toured the facilities, took notes, interviewed prisoners. The inspection was thorough, professional, and completely unnecessary. The Americans weren't hiding anything because there was nothing to hide. One of the Red Cross officials was Swiss German. During his interview with Klaus, conducted in German, he asked standard questions about treatment, food, medical care. Klaus answered honestly, excellent, sufficient, available. And recreational provisions, the inspector asked. We have access to a canteen, Klaus said, with Coca-Cola. The inspector smiled slightly. Yes, I've observed this. The American soft drink, quite popular. Too popular, Klaus said, surprising himself with his vehemence. They give it away. To prisoners. They waste sugar on prisoners while their enemies starve. The inspector's smile faded. Herr Richter, America is not starving. No American is starving. The situation in Europe is not replicated in the United States. I know, Klaus said. That's the problem. The inspector closed his notebook. Off the record, his expression said. What do you think this means? It means we lost before we started, Klaus said flatly. It means everything was a lie. The Führer, the propaganda, the promises, all lies. They told us America was weak. They told us we could win. But a nation that can give Coca-Cola to prisoners, that nation was never going to lose. The inspector said nothing for a long moment. Then, perhaps this realization will help, in the long term, for reconstruction. Klaus laughed bitterly. Reconstruction with American Coca-Cola. Yes, perhaps. That night, Klaus lay awake in his bunk, listening to the sounds of the camp. Electric fans humming, someone laughing in the distance. The clink of glass bottles being collected for washing and reuse, because even with their abundance, Americans recycled. They wasted extravagantly, but also conserved systematically, a paradox Klaus couldn't reconcile. He thought about the bottle, the curved glass, perfectly molded, the paper label printed in precise colors, the metal cap stamped with the company logo, the liquid itself, mixed according to a secret formula, carbonated under pressure, chilled to exact temperatures, delivered fresh. Each bottle represented a supply chain, represented factories and farms and distribution networks, represented workers in trucks and railways, all coordinated to deliver a single luxury item to every corner of America and beyond. Represented an economy so vast, so efficient, so absurdly productive that it could afford to spend resources on prisoners' pleasure while simultaneously fighting wars in Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. The German economy, Klaus now understood, had been a fraction of this. The entire German industrial base, everything Krupp and Thyssen and IG Farben had built, wouldn't have been enough to compete, even if Germany had never gone to war. The Americans had simply outproduced them in peacetime, were outproducing them now in wartime, and would outproduce them forever because the fundamental capacity difference was that enormous. The Coca-Cola was just the visible evidence, the smallest, most trivial proof of a much larger truth. "Otto," Klaus whispered to the bunk above him. "Are you awake?" "Yes." "The war is over, isn't it? I mean truly over. Not the fighting, that will continue, but the outcome. It's already decided." "Yes," Otto said quietly. "It was probably decided before we even invaded Poland. We just didn't know it." "Because of Coca-Cola?" "Because of what Coca-Cola represents." Klaus closed his eyes. Tomorrow there would be another work detail, another break time, another cooler full of ice and bottles. He would drink one, he always did now, had stopped resisting, and it would taste sweet and cold and perfect. And it would taste like the truth. October 1944. News filtered into the camp slowly, filtered through censors and delays, but it came nonetheless. The war in Europe was entering its final phase. Soviet forces were advancing from the east. American and British forces were grinding through France. German cities were being reduced to rubble by endless bombing. Klaus received a letter from his mother, miraculously delivered after 4 months in transit. She wrote about the bombing of Essen, about their apartment building being destroyed, about living in a shelter with 50 other families. She wrote about food rations being cut again, 1,000 calories now, barely enough to survive. She wrote about Klaus's sister, who'd been sent to work in a factory and hadn't been heard from in weeks. Klaus read the letter in the canteen, a half-finished Coca-Cola on the table in front of him. The juxtaposition was obscene. His mother was starving while he sat in Louisiana drinking a luxury beverage. His sister was missing while he was safe, well-fed, comfortable. The guilt was crushing, but beneath the guilt was something else. Anger. Anger at the Reich that had started this war. Anger at the leaders who'd promised victory while secretly knowing the odds. Anger at the propaganda that had convinced millions to fight for a cause that was doomed from the start. Anger at himself for believing, for fighting, for not seeing the truth sooner. He picked up the Coca-Cola bottle and stared at it. In his mother's world, this single bottle would be a miracle, worth more than money, more than gold, because it represented calories, sugar, life itself. In his world, the world of American captivity, it was Tuesday afternoon. "They never had a chance, did they?" Klaus said to Hans, who was reading his own letter from home. "Our families, Germany, none of them ever had a chance." Hans looked up, his eyes red. "No." "The Coca-Cola," Klaus said. "It's not about the drink. It's about the fact that they have Coca-Cola, that they can make it, ship it, give it away, and never worry about the cost. That's the war right there, in a bottle." Hans set his letter down. "When I go home, if I go home, what do I tell them? That we were defeated by a nation so rich it could afford to give prisoners sodas? Who would believe that?" "The truth is always harder to believe than the lie," Klaus said. "That's why the lies worked so well." Around them, other prisoners sat in similar poses, reading letters, confronting the same cognitive dissonance. They were the lucky ones, captured, fed, safe. Their families were not lucky. Their nation was not lucky. And the difference between American luck and German luck was so vast, so absolute, that it redefined what luck meant. Klaus finished his Coca-Cola. The sweetness didn't comfort him anymore. It just reminded him of everything that had been lost, everything that had never really existed in the first place, except as propaganda. Fever dreams. December 1944. Christmas came to Camp Ruston. The Americans decorated a tree in the main compound, hung lights, distributed packages from the Red Cross. Each prisoner received chocolate, cigarettes, and a bottle of Coca-Cola wrapped in festive paper. Klaus held his gift, this bizarre token of goodwill from captors to captives. He thought about previous Christmases. 1939, before the war, when there was still optimism. 1940, after France fell, when victory seemed certain. 1941, when the Russian campaign should have ended but didn't. 1942, when Stalingrad became a graveyard. 1943 in Africa, where he'd celebrated with half a tin of sardines shared among 3 men. Now, in 1944, as a prisoner of war, he had more than in any previous year. The German prisoners gathered in the recreation hall. Someone had a harmonica. They sang Stille Nacht, Silent Night. the carol that was older than the Reich, that would outlive it. Their voices carried through the Louisiana darkness, homesick and heartbroken and bewildered. Klaus drank his Christmas Coca-Cola slowly, savoring it despite everything, despite the guilt and anger and shame. It was cold and sweet and perfect, like every other one he'd drunk in 6 months of captivity. Consistent, reliable, American. "Next Christmas," Otto said beside him, "the war will be over." "Yes?" Klaus agreed. "What do you think we'll be drinking?" Klaus looked at his bottle. "Water, probably, if we're lucky. But not Coca-Cola. No, that requires winning, or at least not losing so badly." They sat in silence, listening to the carol, thinking about home, thinking about the gap between propaganda and reality, thinking about bottles and ice and casual abundance and what it all meant about power and capacity and the fundamental nature of the war they'd lost. The Coca-Cola bottle was empty now. Klaus stood and walked to the collection bin, dropped it in with dozens of others. The clink of glass on glass sounded like bells, like surrender, like truth finally admitted after years of denial. He went back to his bunk and slept, dreaming of ice-cold drinks in a nation that could afford them, dreams that were more nightmare than comfort because they were real. May 8th, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The war was over. Klaus heard the announcement in the camp yard, listened to the cheering from American guards and staff. The Germans stood silent, processing what they'd known was coming, but hoping somehow wouldn't. It was done. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. The master race had been mastered. The inevitable victory had ended in unconditional surrender. Klaus thought about Coca-Cola. He couldn't help it. The association was too strong now. The drink had become his personal symbol for everything the war had taught him about power and truth and propaganda's lies. Germany had produced 25,000 military vehicles in 1944, working at absolute maximum capacity, scraping every resource, melting down church bells for metal. America had produced over 100,000 that same year, while simultaneously producing refrigerators, automobiles, luxury goods, and billions of bottles of Coca-Cola. The comparison was obscene. The war had been decided by production capacity, and America's capacity was so far beyond Germany's that the contest had never been real. "What do we do now?" Hans asked, standing beside Klaus. "Wait," Klaus said. "Wait to go home. Wait to see what's left. And then rebuild, if they let us. If there's anything left to rebuild." The American guards distributed Coca-Colas to celebrate the victory, to prisoners and guards alike. No distinction. Klaus took his, opened it, drank mechanically. The taste was familiar now, no longer shocking, just normal. He'd become accustomed to American abundance. That was perhaps the most disturbing transformation of all. August 1945, repatriation began. Klaus stood in line with thousands of other German POWs, waiting to board ships back to Europe. He weighed 165 pounds, 20 pounds more than when he'd surrendered in Tunisia 2 years earlier. He was healthy, rested, educated in ways he'd never wanted to be. The camp quartermaster distributed final provisions for the journey, rations, cigarettes, and bottles of Coca-Cola. Klaus took his, held it, remembered the first time he'd tasted it in July 1944. "Take more if you want," the quartermaster said in German. "We got plenty. We got plenty." The 3 words that summarized everything. Klaus took 3 extra bottles, not for himself, for his mother if she was alive, for his sister if she could be found. For witnesses to what he'd seen, proof that the stories he'd tell were real. The ship departed from New Orleans, heading across the Atlantic toward Germany. Klaus stood on deck, watching America recede. Behind him, abundance, electricity, ice, Coca-Cola. Ahead, rubble, starvation, defeat, truth. He pulled out one of his hoarded bottles, opened it, took a sip. The sweetness flooded his mouth one last time, and he thought, this is what we were fighting against. Not democracy or freedom or any high ideal. This, practical material, overwhelming capacity. And we never had a chance. March 1946. Klaus returned to Essen. Or what had been Essen. The city was skeletal, bombed into abstraction, barely recognizable. His mother had survived, living in half a basement. His sister was dead, killed in an air raid in February 1945, 3 months before the war ended. Klaus moved through the wreckage like a ghost, carrying his memories of Louisiana like precious stones. He still had one bottle of Coca-Cola carefully preserved. He gave it to his mother. She held it, turning it in the weak sunlight filtering through rubble. "What is this?" "It's called Coca-Cola," Klaus said. "It's an American drink. They gave it to prisoners." His mother started crying, not from joy, from incomprehension, from the vast gulf between her world and the world Klaus described. How could she understand abundance when she was eating one meal a day? How could she grasp American capacity when she was burning debris for heat? Klaus took the bottle back, unopened. "Never mind, I'll save it. As a reminder." "Of what?" "Of what we were really fighting," Klaus said. "Of why we lost." He set the bottle on a shelf in the ruins of their apartment. It stayed there for years, a talisman, a memorial, a confession in glass. 1967. 23 years after he first tasted Coca-Cola in Camp Ruston, Klaus Richter sat in his modest apartment in rebuilt Essen talking to a young university student researching POW experiences. The student was earnest, idealistic, barely old enough to remember the war. "What was the most significant moment of your captivity?" the student asked. Klaus reached to the shelf, pulled down the bottle. Dusty now, label faded, but still recognizable. "This," Klaus said. "The first time I drank Coca-Cola." The student looked confused. "A soft drink." "Not a soft drink," Klaus corrected. "Proof, evidence, the physical manifestation of everything the Reich had lied about. They told us America was weak, decadent, divided. They told us we'd win because we were stronger, more disciplined, more committed. Then I arrived in Louisiana and they gave me this." He held up the bottle. "They gave it to prisoners. Every day, ice cold, 5 cents, unlimited. While my mother was starving in Essen, American prisoners were drinking sodas for pleasure. That's when I knew we'd lost. Not because of the fighting, because of this. Because a nation that can casually distribute luxury beverages to captured enemies is not a weak nation. It's an unstoppable one," the student wrote furiously. "Did this change your political views?" Klaus laughed bitterly. "My political views? It shattered my understanding of reality. I'd spent 6 years believing propaganda that seemed reasonable because I had no other reference point. Then I saw the truth. America wasn't just richer than Germany. It was richer by orders of magnitude we couldn't comprehend. The entire war was predicated on lies about American weakness that anyone who had actually studied their economy would have known were absurd. But we didn't study. We believed, and millions died because of it." "Do you think about it often?" the student asked. "Every time I see Coca-Cola," Klaus said. "It's sold in Germany now, you know. Have been since '49. I buy it sometimes. Drink it. Remember?" "What do you remember?" Klaus was quiet for a long moment. "I remember learning that the truth is usually the opposite of what you're told by people in power. I remember understanding, too late, that propaganda works because we want to believe it. And I remember the taste of cold Coca-Cola on a hot Louisiana afternoon, and knowing that my entire worldview had been a lie, and that thousands of men had died for that lie, and that I'd helped perpetuate it." He set the bottle back on the shelf. "I keep this to remind myself. Never believe comfortable lies. Reality doesn't care about your ideology. It just is. And if you ignore reality, if you believe your propaganda over your enemy's demonstrable capacity, you don't just lose battles, you lose everything." 1989. Klaus Richter, age 71, sat in his living room watching television. The Berlin Wall was falling. East and West Germany were reuniting. The Cold War was ending. And on his screen, he saw something that made him laugh and cry simultaneously. Coca-Cola advertisements everywhere. On the wall itself, painted by ecstatic Berliners, in the hands of celebrating crowds, distributed by Western companies as symbols of freedom and capitalism triumphant. The drink had outlasted the Reich, had outlasted Stalin, had become the symbol of Western victory in a conflict that had spanned Klaus's entire adult life. He walked to his shelf, picked up the 1944 bottle. 55 years old now, a relic of another age. He'd never thrown it away, never opened it, never let anyone else touch it. It was his witness, his proof, his confession. "You were right," he said to the bottle. "You were always right. The nation that can make you, ship you, give you away. That's the nation that wins. Not because of ideology or propaganda or racial theories, because of capacity, because of production, because of resources so vast they seem infinite." He held the bottle up to the light from the television where young Germans drank contemporary Coca-Colas and celebrated freedom. The liquid inside had probably evaporated, the metal cap rusted, the contents worthless, but the symbol remained. The truth remained. The lesson remained. 1998. Klaus Richter died peacefully at age 80, surrounded by family. His grandchildren cleaned out his apartment, puzzled by the old Coca-Cola bottle on the shelf. "Should we throw this out?" his grandson asked. Klaus's daughter, born in 1950 named Helga, took the bottle carefully. No, he wanted this preserved. He wrote about it in his memoirs, said it was the most important artifact of his war experience. "A Coke bottle." "Read his book," Helga said. "You'll understand." The bottle went to a museum in Essen, donated with Klaus's papers and photographs. There it sits today in a case labeled POWs Experience Collection, The Reality Behind the Wire. Museum visitors, mostly students, some veterans, occasional tourists, stop and stare at the simple glass bottle. They read the placard explaining its significance. Most move on quickly, not quite grasping why a soft drink would merit preservation. But some understand. Some see what Klaus saw in July 1944, that wars are won not by ideology or will or racial superiority, but by capacity, by the ability to produce, distribute, and sustain, by having so much that you can give luxury to enemies and never notice the cost. The Coca-Cola bottle became Klaus Richter's testimony, his witness to the moment when propaganda shattered against reality. His proof that the Thousand-Year Reich was defeated not just by armies and bombs, but by ice-cold bottles of sweetness distributed casually to prisoners in Louisiana. Historians who study the POW program note the psychological impact of American abundance. German prisoners consistently reported shock at the material conditions of captivity. Not just adequate, but comfortable. Not just humane, but generous. The cognitive dissonance was deliberate. America wanted German soldiers to see firsthand that everything they'd been told was a lie. The strategy worked. Studies conducted in the 1950s found that German POWs held in America were significantly more likely to support democracy, reject Nazism, and emigrate to the United States than those held in Soviet camps. The difference wasn't interrogation or propaganda. It was experience. It was seeing, touching, tasting the reality of American capacity. And often, that reality came in a bottle. Klaus Richter never forgot the taste of his first Coca-Cola. In interviews conducted throughout his life, he returned to that moment again and again. The cold glass, the sweet fizz, the shock of realization. He described it as the instant his worldview collapsed when 6 years of indoctrination met undeniable physical evidence and lost. The bottle, he wrote in his 1985 memoir, contained more than carbonated sugar water. It contained truth, the truth that we had been lied to, the truth that America was not weak but overwhelmingly strong, the truth that our war was not glorious but futile, the truth that ideology means nothing against industrial capacity. He continued, "Every time I drank Coca-Cola in that camp, and I drank hundreds over 14 months, I was drinking defeat. Sweet, cold, refreshing defeat. And by the end, I was grateful for it, because defeat meant survival. Defeat meant learning the truth. Defeat meant having a chance to rebuild something real instead of dying for something false." The Coca-Cola Company, for its part, understood the propaganda value of its product. During World War II, the company established 64 bottling plants overseas to supply American troops. They sold Coke to the military for 5 cents per bottle, the same as civilian price, taking no profit from the war. Company President Robert Woodruff declared that every man in uniform gets a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents, wherever he is and whatever it cost the company. The cost was enormous. The company spent millions ensuring supply lines reached every theater of war: Europe, Pacific, Africa, Asia. They trained technical observers to operate bottling equipment in combat zones. They shipped syrup, bottles, caps, and machinery across submarine-infested oceans, all to maintain the fiction that American soldiers could have their familiar pleasures, even in war. It wasn't a fiction, though. That was Klaus's revelation. It was reality. America could afford to ship billions of bottles of soda around the world while simultaneously building the largest military force in history. The capacity was real. The abundance was real. The casual waste was real. For German prisoners like Klaus Richter, confronting that reality was more devastating than any battlefield defeat. Battles could be explained away. Bad luck, poor leadership, tactical errors. But Coca-Cola couldn't be explained away. It was evidence. Physical, tangible, undeniable evidence that every propaganda claim about American weakness was a lie. The bottle Klaus kept on his shelf for 54 years wasn't a souvenir. It was a confession, an admission that he'd been wrong, that his nation had been wrong, that the entire ideological foundation of the Reich was built on delusions about enemy weakness and German superiority. And the confession was written in sugar and carbonation and cold glass. Today, historians recognize that the American POW program was one of the most successful psychological warfare operations of World War II. By treating prisoners well, better than international law required, better than German prisoners expected, America demonstrated capacity in ways that no propaganda could refute. The approximately 380,000 German POWs held in the United States experienced American abundance firsthand. They worked on farms and saw agricultural productivity. They unloaded supply trucks and saw industrial output. They ate in mess halls and tasted material surplus. They shopped in canteens and encountered consumer goods Germany couldn't dream of producing during wartime. And they drank Coca-Cola, millions of bottles of it, distributed as casually as water, consumed without thought, discarded without care. When these men returned to Germany, gaunt from captivity, but healthier than civilians who'd stayed home, they carried stories that contradicted every Nazi claim about American degeneracy and weakness, stories that explained why Germany had lost before the war even began. The stories weren't always believed. Many Germans, devastated by defeat, clung to excuses, betrayal, overwhelming numbers, cruel fate. But the POWs knew better. They'd seen the enemy's homeland. They'd witnessed the capacity. They'd tasted the Coca-Cola. Klaus Richter's bottle stands as testimony for all of them, for every German soldier who drank sweet American soda in a prison camp and understood, finally, what they'd been fighting against, for every moment of cognitive dissonance when propaganda collided with physical reality, for every slow realization that the truth was exactly opposite of what they'd been taught. The bottle is more than history. It's a lesson about the dangers of propaganda, about the importance of understanding your enemy's true capabilities, about the fatal consequences of believing comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. It's a lesson written in glass and sugar and carbonation, a lesson that cost millions of lives to learn, a lesson that Klaus Richter spent 54 years trying to teach. And it all started with a single sip on a hot Louisiana afternoon when one German soldier tasted American abundance and understood, too late, what his nation had truly lost. Epilogue: The Power of Small Truths. The story of Klaus Richter and his Coca-Cola bottle reveals a fundamental principle of warfare that transcends tactics and strategy. Wars are won by economies, not armies, by industrial capacity, not ideological fervor, by the ability to sustain supply and overwhelm through sheer material advantage. Germany lost World War II for many reasons, but the fundamental cause was miscalculation. German leadership believed their own propaganda about enemy weakness. They convinced themselves that American industry was soft, inefficient, divided by class and race conflicts. They assured their soldiers that victory was inevitable because Germanic discipline would triumph over democratic chaos. Every assumption was wrong, and German POWs in American camps learned this truth one Coca-Cola at a time. The bottle on Klaus Richter's shelf, now in the Essen Museum of Modern History, represents thousands of similar moments. Moments when propaganda met reality and shattered. Moments when soldiers confronted evidence they couldn't deny or rationalize away. Moments when the slow, painful process of understanding began. These moments didn't happen through lectures or interrogations. They happened through experience, through eating bread that wasn't stretched with sawdust, through sleeping on mattresses instead of straw, through receiving medical care from doctors who had actual medicine, through drinking cold sodas on hot afternoons, through Coca-Cola, that simple, sweet, carbonated drink that symbolized everything the Reich had tried to hide from its soldiers, The truth that America wasn't weak, but staggeringly strong. The truth that abundance trumps discipline. The truth that industrial capacity matters more than ideological purity. Klaus Richter never forgot that truth. He carried it home to Germany, taught it to his children, wrote it in his memoirs, and preserved it in a dusty bottle on a shelf. Never believe them when they tell you the enemy is weak, he wrote near the end of his life. Check for yourself. Look at what they produce, what they consume, what they waste. That's where truth lives, not in speeches or parades or propaganda, but in the mundane details of daily life. In bottles of Coca-Cola, in reality, you can taste. The lesson remains relevant. In an age of information warfare and competing narratives, Klaus Richter's story reminds us that truth has weight. Physical, tangible, undeniable weight. You can taste it. You can hold it. You can keep it on a shelf for 54 years as testimony. And sometimes that truth comes in a bottle.